I want to introduce to you Brother Kevin Hamzik. Brother Kevin is very young right now.
Aging by the minute, I think, here.
Yeah. And when I ask about his age, and I say, I can be your dad. Can you imagine? Yeah, so he's very young and very good brother. And I swear to you, I said, if I had a choice, I would request Brother Kevin to come here and stay with us. And then I asked Brother Kevin, if he had a choice, how many percent he will want to come back here? And he said, very high percentage. So it means that we are very blessed to have Brother Kevin here. And Brother Kevin is in the 5th year of formation. And he's an artist. And when he came here and he talked with me, and Charlie and I asked him to give a presentation about something, and then he came up with this topic. And then every word he said to me caused goosebumps on my body. It was wonderful, and I guarantee you, if you miss it, you miss it. And I want to introduce to you Brother Kevin. He pays me later.
All right. Well, good evening. Welcome. Happy feast. It's good to be here with all of you. I feel like I have aged a lot in the last few hours. I think I'm stress. But it's good to be here with all of you. As Father said, I am Brother Kevin. I am a simply professed friar, so I am under vows, but I'm not all the way there yet. And I'm an artist. I normally do spiritual and religious works now. So tonight I'm going to be going through a lot of my reflections on beauty and art through our Franciscan tradition. So we're going to start off by looking through a couple of events from the life of St. Francis, and we're going to see how that in turn ended up inspiring some people who came after him, St. Bonaventure, St. Clare, and Scotus. So before we go into that, my humble guardian asked me to go into a little bit of my backstory on how I got into art. And so my grandfather was a very creative person. He wasn't an artist in the traditional sense of the word, but he was very much a handyman. He liked building things and fixing things, and so I credit a lot of my skill inheriting it from him. And so I always kind of liked art. It was my favorite class growing up. I was lucky enough to go to Catholic school all my life, so art was part of the curriculum. And I always liked it because, it was really hands-on. I was doing things constantly and not just listening to somebody talk. So the roles are reversed now. So I'm the one talking and you guys are just listening. So that's kind of funny. But when it came time to make the decision for college, I was afraid of going into art because I personally felt like I wasn't going to make it, or I wasn't good enough, so I had a lot of those fears in me. But then my junior year of high school, my high school goes on mission trips every year, and something in me was pushing me to go, but I had to apply, and so I applied, and they said, sure, you can come, and so I ended up off to a good start. All right, so I went here. This is Igwe, Dominican Republic. It is a small town about an hour or two from the coast. And the first day that I was there, we went to the community that I was serving in, and this man here, standing next to younger me, 17-year-old me, came up to me and introduced himself and said his name was Lorenzo, and that he was an artist and a carpenter. And so immediately I was kind of like, okay, I need to make friends with this person. And so over the week, we did a lot of different things. I helped to build houses. I helped to build playgrounds. I even helped to run a baseball camp for kids when I was there. And Lorenzo, being a carpenter, was helping us a lot with these projects. And so I got to work alongside of him a lot. And even with the little Spanish that I knew, his English was a lot better than my Spanish. So we could communicate pretty well. And so I remember asking him a lot about art. And then he in turn was asking me about faith, which I thought was interesting because at that point in my life, I didn't really feel like I was very deeply rooted in my faith. You know, I was kind of more focused on the art aspect of everything and not necessarily my faith. But I remember seeing and hearing about how his art really impacted his community and how happy people were that he was making the things that he was making. And I saw that and I wanted it. And I'll never forget the day that I left, we were leaving. Lorenzo came up to me and he said, you know, like, what are you gonna do with art? And I said, I don't know, like, I don't think I can do it. And he looked at me and he was like, God can do beautiful things in you, you just have to let him do it. And so it was at that moment that I think all the switches in me flipped and I decided, like, okay, this is what I'm gonna do with my life. So that was the point that I decided to pursue arts and become an artist. And so I owe a lot to this man here. I definitely would not be here without him. And I don't think that there's any way that I can ever repay him for all that he's done for me. And so that was the beginning of the journey. And then for the religious side, it started here. Not specifically here, but in Italy. When I was a junior in college, my university sponsored a pilgrimage to Rome and Assisi. And I was able to go, and it was the first time that I had really experienced religious art to its fullest. I remember standing in front of the Pieta that Michelangelo did in Rome, and I just remember being blown away by it. And I think that really just kind of flipped another switch in me, and I knew that I could share my faith and my spirituality with people through that. And so that's a little bit about how I began. And so I'm going to start talking now about our Franciscan tradition. And so when we begin to look at art and beauty in the Franciscan tradition, I really think that you have to start way at the beginning. And not this place exactly, but this place, San Damiano. Whether or not this is what it was like when Francis was there, I don't know, but this is how it looks if you would go there now. And it's not really so much about the place, it's more of what was inside of the place, which was this, the San Damiano cross. And so we know that Francis at first was a knight, or at least he wanted to be a knight, and so he was a soldier. And as he was returning from war, he stumbled into San Damiano Chapel, which was falling into ruins at the time, allegedly, and he started praying in front of the San Damiano cross. As St. Bonaventure tells us, For one day when Francis went out to meditate in the fields, he walked near the church of San Damiano, which was threatening to collapse because of age. Impelled by the Spirit, he went inside to pray. As his tear-filled eyes were gazing at the Lord's cross, he heard with his bodily ears a voice coming from that cross, telling him 3 times, "Francis, go and repair my house, which as you see is all being destroyed." And so God literally spoke to Francis through a piece of art. And I believe at least that this would have had to have had some big impact on him and how he saw things. Especially since we know that as he was fixing the church, he would have been spending a whole lot of time with that cross. And, it probably didn't speak to him again after that, but I can imagine, working on something and kind of looking over my shoulder and having the cross that God literally spoke to me there probably would have had something big, would have had something in me moving, And so this would be the beginning of how Francis would start to see the beauty of God in different things. And we get that in different stories from his life, like the Wolf of Gubbio, or, the story of him preaching to the birds, or even the story of him meeting the Sultan. But another part of his conversion experience was meeting the leper. And we get a sense from his testament that this also played a huge role in how he saw things. For when I was in sin, it seemed bitter for me to see lepers, and the Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. And when I left them, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body. So we get a sense here from the beginning of St. Francis's testament that the beauty of God has some kind of transformative power in you. As the lepers to Francis were bitter at one point, and now after he had this experience with the San Damiano cross, what was bitter was turned into sweetness, and he saw the lepers in a different way. And this transformation is something that we don't just see in the life of Francis, but we see it in the Bible as well. I'm often reminded of the prophet Isaiah's turning swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, mostly because we prayed in the divine office, but I think that's also another sign of God's transformative power. And so Francis's life and the way that he saw things and saw God in them really inspired other people. And one of those other people would come to be St. Bonaventure. St. Bonaventure entered the order about 20 years after Francis had died. So he didn't get a chance to meet Francis, but there's a good chance that he probably met some people who knew Francis. Bonaventure was a theologian and a philosopher. He spent a lot of time teaching at the University of Paris. And he's often overshadowed in the theological and philosophy world because his contemporary, Thomas Aquinas, was there at the same time writing the Summa, which we all know and have heard of because a lot of the church teaching of today comes from that. But Bonaventure has a lot of great writings, one of which is called On the Reduction of the Arts to Theology. And in this writing, Bonaventure kind of meshes the arts and theology. He kind of combines the two and gives them kind of like a good relationship to see how they kind of play off of each other. And what's interesting, just from the name, it's called the reduction of the arts to theology. It's not the other way around, which is interesting because I think Bonaventure somehow is trying to tell us that the arts are this big, grand, expansive thing that you kind of have to bring down into theological terms, which I think is really interesting. And so Bonaventure starts off this writing talking about God and what God is in terms of the arts and beauty and everything. And Bonaventure ends up calling God the supreme artisan and the divine creator. And he goes into this and says, we already know of God as the all-good, And if God created everything and everything is beautiful, then God must be the ultimate beauty as well. And he shows us in such a great way by going into the creative process a little bit. And so Bonaventure ends up talking about the creative process and the beginning of it as a way of seeing this. And so when you're creating an art piece, the piece actually exists in the mind of the beholder before it ends up becoming the piece. And so the piece actually exists in the mind of the artist before it is created. And so Bonaventure says that everything that was created had to exist in the mind of God before it was actually created. And so there is this inward-outward movement of creating things. And so if everything existed in the mind of God before it was created, then everything is not only inherently good, but it's also inherently beautiful as well. Because as we've seen, God is not just the all-good, but he is the all-beauty as well. And so with that, we can see God's beauty in all different kinds of things. So we see them in plants, in sunsets, and animals. And so everything becomes kind of a reflection of God in this way, because parts of God exist in everything. And we get this beautiful quote from one of Bonaventure's other writings, the Itinerarium. From these first two steps on which we are taken by the hand to gaze upon God and his imprints, as if they were two wings of the seraph falling about his feet, we can gather that all creatures of the perceptible world lead the spirit of one contemplating and tasting into the timeless God. And so what Bonaventure is saying that everything around us is an imprint of God. And so we can see and find God in everything that we find around us. And when we contemplate those things, that's when we come to know God fully. And so that's where this piece came from. And so when I was creating this piece, it was kind of interesting because over the years it's kind of taken on different meanings, which I think is cool because art is something that comes from the eye of the beholder. But to me, if we think of God as this centerpiece here, you can kind of see, I'm sorry if it's hard to see, but the middle piece there, it's all blended together. There's all different colors in it. It looks really beautiful and pretty. And it's not that the pieces around it aren't beautiful. It's just that they're different from God. But what the pieces around it have are some of these colors that exist in the middle of it. And so if we look at that in the terms of being imprints of God, God basically passes on colors to us, or different traits to us, to show that we are his imprint. And so each of us, even though we aren't God, we each have our own unique part of God in us. And that includes everything around us. And I think that's where Bonaventure also says, every creature is a divine word because it proclaims God. Everything around us proclaims God just because it is. I remember growing up and being in high school, and there were friars telling us about this. And I was kind of like, I don't see how the grass proclaims the goodness of God. And the friars did a good job of telling me and teaching me, the grass just proclaims God because it just is grass. And so everything around us, just because it is, and just because it's doing what it's made to do, it proclaims God in that way. And so we can see from Bonaventure how he talks about the goodness of God and the things around us, and especially in creation. But if we look around us, we also see different people around us. And so how do we know of the beauty of God within different people? Well, I will turn to my sister, some of our sisters, St. Clare, to talk about that. I think St. Clare is one of the most underrated people in our Franciscan tradition. I don't think she gets a lot of the credit that she deserves, especially for what she did in the time that she was living. Clare came from one of the most wealthy families in Assisi, and after hearing Francis preach in the square, she said, I want to live like that. I want to be like that. And so as the story goes, she actually ran away in the middle of the night to join Francis and the brothers. But obviously, being a woman, she couldn't formally join them, so she would begin what we know today as the Poor Clares. And so Clare starts living this life, and she starts inspiring people. And one of those people that she ends up inspiring is Agnes of Prague. Agnes of Prague was kind of like Clare in the sense of she was actual royalty. She was a princess, and she was in line to become queen. But after meeting friars who came to Prague and hearing about Francis and hearing about Clare, where Agnes's life would have been one way, she kind of sees what Clare is doing, and she says, no, I want to live like that. Like, I want to be like that. And so she ends up starting the Poor Clare Monastery in Prague. And then Clare, in turn, gets wind of this, and she says, oh, well, she was raised kind of like me, and I'm sure she's had trouble coming into this life like I have. And so, in turn, we get these beautiful letters that Clare sends to Agnes of Prague. We don't know exactly how many there are, but we still have 4 today. And what's intriguing to me about these letters is that they're not really letters of like how to be a good sister or, motivating her or like telling her, what's the best cleaner to use on this surface or whatnot. Clare is really trying to show Agnes the goodness and beauty of God in her through these letters. And so Clare uses symbolism a lot in these letters in the forms of the crucified Christ and the Eucharist. And so we get the first of those in the second letter to Agnes. But as a poor virgin, embrace the poor Christ. Look upon him who became contemptible for you and follow him, making yourself contemptible in this world for him. Most noble queen, gaze, consider, contemplate, desiring to imitate your spouse. And so Clare here uses this symbol of the poor Christ as the crucifix. So when you see or hear poor Christ in Clare's writing, she's talking about the crucified Christ. And what Clare is encouraging Agnes to do is to contemplate the cross and to see herself in terms of the beauty of what Christ did for us on the cross, and to make herself literally like that beauty, so that in turn she can be the beauty of Christ for other people. And so I think that's pretty incredible of Clare to do for the time that she was living in. And so we see the crucified Christ in this passage, but in the next one we kind of get the Eucharist version of it. And so we see, place your mind before the mirror of eternity. Place your soul in the brilliance of glory. Place your heart in the figure of the divine substance, and through contemplation, transform your entire being into the image of the Godhead itself, so that you too may feel what friends feel in tasting the hidden sweetness that, from the beginning, God himself has reserved for his lovers. And so we kind of get a sense of this being about the Eucharist because she's talking about tasting and sweetness, right? And so what Clare is kind of telling Agnes here is to use the Eucharist as a mirror to see yourself through. And when you see yourself in the Eucharist, you can become the Eucharist and you can become that symbol for other people. And that in turn is how you spread the beauty of God in a different way. And so when I was putting this talk together over the past few weeks, and I was talking about a lot of different aspects of it, Clare kept coming up, and specifically this passage kept coming up. And so I sat with this passage for a while, and in thinking about it and working through it, this came out of it. So, there's this beautiful story of Clare, because Clare and Francis lived during the Crusades. And so, at one point after Francis had died and Clare and the sisters were living at San Damiano, the Saracens were approaching the town of Assisi. And supposedly the sisters were very worried and scared about what was going to happen, if they were going to be attacked or whatnot. And Clare simply put the monstrance in the window. She had so much faith in the Lord and what he could do that she simply placed that in the window and told the sisters to trust God. And so this painting kind of morphs that with this quote, because as you can see in the monstrance, that's not the Eucharist, but it's supposed to be a mirror. And so what I was trying to portray in this is that if you become the mirror of the Eucharist, then you are the one that has the power to transform the hearts of others. Because, as the story goes, the Saracens supposedly saw the Eucharist in the window, and their hearts were changed, and they turned away from Assisi. And so, it is through Clare's knowledge and becoming a mirror of the Eucharist that we too can be transformed and transforms others into the beauty of God. And so Clare gives us this beautiful sense of how to see the beauty of God in ourselves. But we are also human, and our humanness delves into a lot of different things. And so how do we continue to see beauty in our own humanness? And that's where John Duns Scotus comes in. So John Duns Scotus, he was born around the time that Bonaventure died. And so he came a little bit after everybody else. John is actually a Scottish priest. His name actually means John of Duns, Scotland. And John was also a theologian and a philosopher, like his counterpart Bonaventure. But Scotus's main work, he really only has one main work, and that work was a commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard. And what the sentences of Peter Lombard was, it was basically like Peter Lombard just like expressing his faith and his theology and his thinking beyond different theological thoughts and thinkings. And so Scotus takes that and he kind of comments on each one. He kind of argues for them and argues against them in different ways. And one of those points that he argues against is this point of individuality. Now, Scotus does a very intriguing thing with individuality, and he talks about this term haecheity, which is basically translated into thisness. And so what Scotus tells us, he gives us this long, drawn-out kind of thing on thisness, or haecheity, which we get a sense from this little passage from it. Because there is among beings something indivisible into subjective parts, that is such that it is formally incompatible for it to be divided into several parts, each of which it is, the question is not what it is by which such a division is formally incompatible with it, but rather what it is by which as a proximate and intrinsic foundation. Now, if you read that and automatically know what he's saying, congratulations, you are way better than I am and way better than most theological scholars. So I kind of did a loose translation of this. Because there is something about us that cannot be taken apart, the question is not, what is it not, but rather, what is it that is intrinsic about us? So Scotus's term of haecheity or thisness, in our own uniqueness, talks about what we are, and it focuses intrinsically on what makes us who we are. And so Scotus is not saying it's not about what we aren't, it's about who we are in what we are. And so Scotus, in turn, talks about this intrinsic value within us and about how there is a uniqueness and a beauty of each person in us, and that is intrinsic in us, and that's what makes us unique from each other. So you can break us down into individual parts and individual pieces, but every part of that, of ourselves, contains that intrinsic value and intrinsic beauty in us. And so he does this really interesting thing of saying, we have an intrinsic beauty in us that makes us unique. The only problem with this is that we tend to only see it on the outside and not necessarily on the inside. I think it's really easy for us to, look around the room and see that we're physically different from one another, right? But I don't think we tend to necessarily contemplate and think about how different we are on the inside from each other. And part of that is that we're human, and so we're broken, and so we have this imperfection in us, and we have this brokenness about us just because we're human. And Scotus and Bonaventure both talk about this, but not in the sense of like, oh, there's something wrong with us. This is just part of who we are. But I don't know about you, but I often can get caught up in my own imperfections and brokenness. And when you do that, how are you supposed to see yourself as beautiful? How do you see yourself as beautiful through this brokenness that we all have in us? And so when thinking about this, I would like to bring up this Japanese art form, which is kintsugi. Kintsugi is a traditional Japanese art form where a kintsugi master takes a broken piece of pottery and they mend it back together with gold lacquer. And they do this not to simply just put it back together, but because from that point on, they start to see that object as more beautiful as being broken. And so the brokenness, instead of it being a defining feature of it, just becomes part of that piece of pottery. And so it starts to encompass the beauty of it still, even though it's broken. And so what if we thought of ourselves in this way? What if instead of focusing on every time in our life that we were imperfect, or that we screwed up, or that we felt broken, instead of looking at ourselves as these broken pieces, what if we just saw ourselves as beautiful in that way? What if we just saw our brokenness and our imperfections as part of our own beauty? I think that is pretty transformative if we start to think of ourselves in that way. Because we were made this way, and God doesn't make mistakes. And so, if God doesn't make mistakes, and we were made this way, then what does that say about us? That this is how God wanted us to be. And God sees us in all of this, in all of our brokenness, and all of our times of imperfection and screw-ups and everything, and he still sees us as beautiful. And that's how we're called to see each other. If we begin to look at each other in this way instead of what we aren't, that's how we can start to see each other as beautiful, and that's how we build each other up in that beauty. You might have noticed at the beginning when I was talking about myself, I kind of skipped a few years there. My original dream My one goal and dream in life was to be a car designer. That was what I wanted to do with my life. That was my one thing. My grandfather and my father were really into cars when I was growing up, and so I naturally got into cars through them and going to different car shows with them. It was something that I always looked forward to when I was growing up. And so when it became time for college and to start studying, I decided, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to design cars. I had this vision of driving around in a car that I had designed, or walking down the street and seeing cars that I designed in people's driveways. And I was like, that's how I know that I've made it. My car is sitting in somebody else's driveway. So I went to school, and luckily the program that I was in, my advisor and my professors were very open to me trying this out and exploring this aspect of what I wanted to do. And so for the first 2 years of college, I spent designing a car top to bottom, inside out. And I remember sitting there at the end of my sophomore year with it all laid out on the table, and I felt very unfulfilled in it. And the peace that I had once felt making art, all of that took away. And so it was at that point that I knew that I had to give up that dream. And to this day, it's still one of the hardest things that I've had to do. And I'll admit, for a while, I sat there in that brokenness. I sat there and thought about how I was right all along, that I wasn't going to make it in the art world, and that, I was wasting time, I was wasting money studying this thing that wasn't going to work out. But I learned about this in art history class. And again, something clicked in me, and I said, no, there's something more to this. And so at that point, I stopped dwelling on that dream. Yeah, I gave it up, and it was hard, and there were days that I definitely struggled with it more than others. But at that point, I knew that there was something more to this gift that God had given me than that. And so I think if we stop dwelling on what we aren't, and we start focusing on what we are, that's where our beauty comes from. That's how we see God's beauty in us. And so I want to share this quote with you. This is from the book Art and Faith. It's by Makoto Fujimura, and he writes a whole chapter on this notion of kintsugi. It occurred to me that God has beheld me, a broken vessel, just like the kintsugi master holds tenderly the fragments he collects. God's collection includes all of my joys, loss, and pain. I realize, too, that I, too, can be beheld, not as I will be, but as I am at this very moment. A journey towards the new begins with an experience of raw authenticity of brokenness, tears, and healing. This has become one of my favorite quotes in thinking about beauty and individuality and that kind of thing, because when we feel broken, when we feel like there's no hope for us, and we just feel like we're in a million pieces, it's so comforting to know that God is sitting there holding all of those pieces together and still seeing the beauty in it. And that's what we have to see in ourselves. We have to see ourselves, even when we're falling apart and we don't feel like we're good enough, that we're still beautiful because we are who we are. That's how creation does it, just by being itself. Just by the bird flying through the air, it's proclaiming God. And so we need to walk around and proclaim God just by being who we are. And not trying to hide that brokenness or imperfections, but embracing it and being one with it. Because as Thomas Merton says, there is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. Because we don't see it that way. We don't see ourselves in that way. But I guarantee you, if you're walking around feeling depressed or broken and imperfect, and you walk past somebody that you know, or you go to a family member's house, they're not going to see that imperfection in you. They're going to see the sun in you. They're going to see the sun shining through you. So that's how we transform people's lives. So that we start seeing the sun not just in everybody around us, but in ourselves. We see the sun shining through us in all of our cracks, so that the sun becomes that gold that's holding us together. Because we are the sun, because God created us to be who we are, which is beautiful, and which is perfect in His eyes. And so we have to see ourselves as perfect in our own eyes. And so to conclude this, I want to go back to the San Damiano cross. Because this cross is not just important to us Franciscans because it was the one that spoke to Francis, but because of the image of Christ that it gives us. Christ is not here dying in front of us. He's not suffering. He's not saying, look what I'm doing for you. But He's awake. He's holding His arms open to us. He's looking right at you and saying, I'm here waiting for you. And so that's how we have to see ourselves to each other, that we're waiting for each other. We're waiting for God. We're waiting to see God around us, in each other. And so I hope as you continue to see different art pieces and see different beauty around you, you start to see God around you as well. And you start to see God in yourself, no matter how broken or imperfect or whatever you think you are, that God is still there loving you for who you are. And in everything that you do, may the Lord give you His peace. Thank you.
Oh.
Well done, Brother Kevin.
Thank you. So I don't want to just shoo you off yet, so, if you have any questions or comments, I can take a few. So, yeah.
The art pieces that you displayed next to the quotes, were any of those yours?
Yeah, most of them were mine.
I see most of them are yours.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Yes.
So right, I just finished reading that book, interestingly.
Oh, really?
It was wonderful.
It is. It's a great book, yeah.
And then that just really struck me with the Suji, S-U-G-I-E,
Mhm.
yeah, the art form,
Yep.
which is just, and he did some of the 4 of the Gospels.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And his art is very abstract.
It is, yeah.
It's beautiful. Like,
Yeah.
It sounds very, very intense because there's layers of, yeah.
There's layers and layers to it, but each layer holds its own beauty in a way. Yeah. And it comes out in the whole of it all. It's
Yeah,
very.
I'd love to see it in person.
Yeah, it's
I can't really figure, how it would come out.
right. Yeah, right.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. Father.
I'll give it a hard time.
Okay.
So actually, I get exactly what you want to deliver today. But if people come to me or come to my holy people of God, and ask us what is the difference between Franciscan beauty and the other traditional beauty, how can we answer?
That's a good question. I think personally, from my point of view, I think Franciscan beauty, we talk about it in an intrinsic way. So we talk about beauty as being an inherent part of us. Whereas, so who we are internally, like our being, our soul, our personality, us friars, we see that as beauty. I think other orders just see the beauty that's on the face. So they don't look at the beauty necessarily that's inside of everything. They just look at the beauty that's on the outside. So I hope that answers your question good.
No, I want to help my holy people.
Okay, that's it, yeah. Yes.
So some of your work is abstract, some of it is impressionistic, some of it is realistic. What are you drawn to one style more than the other, and why?
I wouldn't say that I'm drawn to a specific style. I would say that I like the viewer to think a little bit when they see my piece. So I don't like it to just be one straightforward thing. You know, I like people to sit with them and reflect on them and kind of pull themselves into the piece and see how the piece is talking to them through it. So if that makes sense, I hope. Yeah. Thank you.
Do we know how many artists there are in the Catholic Church?
No idea. It's a great question. I don't know. Yeah. That'd be interesting to know.
Capuchins and Franciscans.
Yeah.
Dominicans.
Yeah, I'm sure the orders that are more monastic probably have more. I would think, because, you know, not to hate on the monastic orders or the monks or anything, but they don't have as much to do as some of us other orders do.
Yeah.
A monastic order is more enclosed. And so they don't go out and like do direct service for people. They're more just communities living with each other. Mm-hmm.
So all these pieces that you displayed that were next to the quotes, where's the great art collection? Where's it at right now?
It's all over the place. I like to leave a piece in different places that I've lived. So this one is staying here at the Casa. I don't know what the plan is with it, but Charlie, the director, was the one that kind of asked me to do one. So this one is staying here. I have a few pieces in Santa Barbara. I have a piece in Malibu. I have a piece at St. Bonaventure University. The Friars have one there. There's one in Silver Spring, Maryland. There's one in DC. So they're all over the place, really. A lot of my earlier works are on display at my parents' house.
Where's the car?
The car is at my parents' house. Yeah.
Where are your parents living?
They're in Cleveland. Yeah. All right, well,
Actually, so the Franciscan one would be not sort of monastic, but what would you define it as?
I don't want to say we're missionaries, but we're more of like a missionary kind of mindset. We kind of go out and be among the people and serve people on the margins. And so we kind of serve the poor, you know. I think as we're moving forward now, we're starting to kind of reflect more on that, because we're all coming together into one province in the U.S., and so that's a big question. What are we doing with ministries now? And so,
Come together as one province?
mhm.
Meaning,
So like, the friars are kind of split up into provinces, which are geographic, and so in the U.S. currently there are 6 different ones, just based on geographic locations, and so those 6 in the U.S. are now combining into one, and so there's going to be one province that covers the entire United States. Yes?
When I was 15 in 1968, a long time ago, my high school from Philadelphia had a trip to Italy, and we kind of partied all night long a lot of times, since I always missed the early morning tour buses, but I had rented a Vespa, and made my way over to the St. Peter's and got to see the Pietà before it had been vandalized, and it was like, here's the altar and here's the Pietà. And at age 15, I wasn't too sophisticated when it came to art. But I just remember looking at that and saying, the hand that brought this out of the hunk of marble had to be guided by God.
I agree, yeah.
It was a moment. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Like,
Definitely, yeah.
I was just
I
a
would
little
agree.
kid, and I'm like, no, this is divine.
Yeah, unfortunately, when I saw it, I couldn't get that close to it because now they have it at a side altar behind glass, and so, but still, even through the glass, I saw the beauty of it, and I thought the same thing, Yeah, and I would think Michelangelo would say, probably agree with you as well, so. All right, well, I want to thank you all again for coming. I appreciate you being here. I really enjoyed doing this for you. And so, happy feast once again. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you have a wonderful drive home to wherever you're going. And have a good rest of your night. Thank you.